Good morning and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. The star of today's show, the stars, are the inimitable commenters in the New Haven Independent, whose passionate, provocative reactions to our news stories breathe life into our city's civic debate. Brian Slattery and I are going to read some of the most interesting comments of the past week. It's been quite a week. Interspersed with local music, songs by some of New Haven's recording artists. And we'd like to thank Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. In the back, you're listening to Eliyahu Hanavi from the Afro-Semitic Experience. Man, I love that band. Sort of like today's show. Some people from Hartford, some from New Haven, some from Hamden. Brian's from Hamden, I'm from New Haven. Both important parts to the New Haven Independent. So, Brian, my favorite thread of the week, I love some of the threads that have been going on the last few days on the Independent stories. I feel like they add so much that our stories are the beginning point.
Yes.
With our reporting.
It's
and then
been
our fantastic commenters who really come from different points of view and usually, with a little help, respect each other but don't hold back on what they think. One of my favorite ones began with a story about a protest. Outside of City Hall, the Party for Socialism, I forget their total name, they used to be the Swoops, Socialist Workers Party, they changed it over time. They demonstrated against U.S. intervention in Venezuela and in support of the president of Venezuela, the socialist, at least they call it socialism, I would argue, maybe it isn't, Nicolas Maduro. And that followed, Brian, there were two other protests right there at City Hall in weeks past by Venezuelan Americans.
Yeah.
Who want the U.S. and other countries to support the protest government, the government of Juan Guaido, and I know I said that wrong, who has the president of the assembly, who's declared himself the president. So showdown's brewing. They're kind of, as the commenters pointed out, this does raise a lot of history. We always have to wonder, how do we apply history and how do we not get lost in history to not realize what's happening in front of our face, right?
Right.
History matters. And it also, not everything is a repeat in every way of what happened before. I've queued it up.
Right.
So Brian and I are going to take turns reading some of the comments here. Brian, why don't you start with 1644, what he wrote?
All right. So on February 15th, he wrote, "When, if ever, has Clement gone to the barrios of Venezuela and spoken to people? Venezuela used to be one of the richest countries in Latin America with a large middle class. Socialism has destroyed it by distributing capital, which is an economy's seed corn, to the very poor to eat, leaving nothing to plant the next year. Now everyone is starving."
Clement, to whom he's referring, was one of the protest organizers, Norm Clement.
Right.
So that's 1644. He wrote that at 8:03. 8:35, Patricia Kane weighed in. Patricia wrote, "The U.S. role in destabilizing democratically elected governments in South America is all about grabbing resources, as it is elsewhere in the world. And people wonder why refugees continue to try to escape and find safety in the U.S. There is no need for poverty or dictatorship. But our colonial-era approach to our neighbors to the south is consistent, and the outcomes will be the same." So the next one is a police officer, an entrepreneur in town, weighed in.
So this happened at 11:02. "Socialism has never worked anywhere in any form. The USSR, Laos, China, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Cambodia, the list goes on, of failed states that created misery and death for untold millions. Capitalism is not innocent, but to paraphrase, it's the worst economic system except for all the others. What's truly ironic is a group of people protesting in favor of a style of government that, if in power, would not grant them the right to dissent. Do you think Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Kim, Castro, Chavez, et al. Would let anyone publicly protest them? Each of those dictators would have had a black Mariah take them right to the gulag without a second blink."
That was from Christian Bruckhart. He's now a detective in New Haven. He also is the co-founder of the Party Bus. So now 1644 weighed back in at 12:04 p.m. on February 15th to Pat. Pat, as you should know, PDVSA, and I think that's the nationalized oil company, if I'm not mistaken, in Venezuela.
Yeah.
Has been around for many, many years. As Aramco powered Saudi Arabia it powered Venezuela. Its decline,
Yeah.
however, began
Known to
under...
us as Citgo.
Yeah, yeah. I noticed Sicko had a full-page ad in the Times
Yeah.
without mentioning the Venezuelan connection,
They never do.
trumpeting its American roots, and I thought
Yeah,
that
yeah.
must have been because of this.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. And its decline, however, began under Chavez. And the complete collapse came when fracking burst the oil price bubble of a few years ago. Many competent ex-PDVSA employees found new jobs in Colombia, which now has a booming oil industry of its own. Well, this discussion's just getting going here. Patricia Kane, way back in at 131. What did she write, Brian? Why don't you do two in a row, because she filed two in a row there.
Yeah, good. At Christian Bruckhart. Socialism exists in Western European countries with a mix of capitalism, and certainly we have many of the programs in place here in the U.S. because of Eugene Debs and the socialists who proposed things like Social Security, not to mention numerous government programs now taken for granted. Capitalism fails periodically, but the banksters and oligarchs sail blithely on. We socialize bank losses but privatize individual financial failures. It must be frustrating not to be able to link socialism to communism anymore. There goes one of the talking points. Connecticut is number one in income equality in the U.S., and the U.S. is high up the list of countries with extreme income inequality. Nothing says capitalism has to exist forever. And then to 1644, she says, in your role as a historian, I do not find your summaries reliable. Hugo Chavez was a breath of fresh air in his attempts to share the wealth and lift the people out of poverty. He took over the oil production, much as Iran did after Mossadegh was elected, and the U.S. flipped out, along with the Brits, who instigated our complicity in the overthrow of Mossadegh and in the installation of the Shah. The fact is, the U.S. has been forever complicit in a form of gunboat diplomacy when it comes to South and Central America, but you'll never hear about it on 24-hour cable news.
So what's your guess on this continuing conversation in the Independence comments section about the protest pro and against the government in Venezuela? Do you think it stopped there, or you think they kept going, Brian?
Well, now they've opened a can of worms that's like 150 years old.
And current.
Yeah.
Really interesting. So let's keep going, because they kept going.
For sure.
And you're hearing that on Dateline New Haven here.
Yes.
103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. And we're doing local music today. And Brian Slattery and I are reading some of the best comments of the week from New Haven Independent News Stories. So Christian Bruckhart came back in. PK, you prove my point. There is not a viable socialist country in the world. There are programs extant in capitalist countries which are influenced by socialism, sometimes positively, in my opinion, but successful countries remain capitalist. The argument that that communism isn't real socialism is just an example of the no true Scotsman fallacy. It was socialism and it failed. Either way, as Solzhenitsyn showed in the Gulag Archipelago, the ideological underpinnings of socialism are embedded with the trend of demagoguery and state oppression. Lenin, Trotsky, and other pillars of socialist thought wrote enthusiastically about using state power to eliminate, quote, class enemies, close quote, of the state, without regard to individual guilt. Socialist purges of the 20th century, such as the liquidation of the kulaks, translate today into the myth of, quote, white privilege, close quote, and other attempts to lump people into distinct classes. I noticed you didn't answer my question. How many socialist countries would allow a group of protesters to publicly rail against the government? None. The freedoms that exist in capitalist democratic countries exist in no socialist country, ever. Finally, I view income inequality as a red herring. There is low income inequality in poor countries because everyone is poor. So striving for income inequality in and of itself won't necessarily improve people's lives. Income inequality is a, quote, problem, close quote, in Western countries because we have Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, etc., and they skew the numbers. But as a population Western countries have, by historical standards, inordinately high standards of living. For example, I found this illuminating. If you make $32,400 a year, you are in the global 1%. So to all those Occupy people still railing against the 1%, congrats. You're probably part of it. And let's see what Patricia Kane had to say back on that.
Yeah, maybe an hour and a half later, she says to Christian Bruckhart, you conflate socialism with dictatorships hiding behind labels like communism and socialism. But authoritarian government is a shapeshifter and labels are disguises. No dictatorship allows for dissent, but that has nothing to do with socialism. Most of Western Europe is happy to wear the socialist label because it defines its values. Call it democratic socialism if that's easier. Capitalism, as it now exists, is a winner take all greed fest in which the haves have purchased government officials to do their bidding, the public be damned. This is just the beginning of the changes you'll see as people learn their power. In the 60s and 70s, almost every major political leader was gunned down. Eugene Debs had to campaign for president from prison, and still change occurred. The comfortably ensconced don't want change because the status quo works for them. People dying because their insurance company won't approve a procedure, or the cost of medication is prohibitively expensive. Young people burdened by educational debt and fewer job opportunities, the chronically oppressed and poor, the middle class decimated by repetitive crimes, the banksters, all demand relief. It's the same in France, England, and the US. To revive an old but useful slogan, you're either part of the solution or part of the problem.
Now, I forgot to put on our list of excerpts. We're reading excerpts from the conversation that has gone on for close to a week, I guess, after a protest by a pro-Maduro group, pro-socialist leader of Venezuela, after the other side of protest at City Hall. And the commenters went back and forth, and I forgot to put a couple of these on our list I'd like to read, Brian. One is from Narcan. He said, the funniest part of this event was Mr. Lugo, that's a protester, shouting at the actual Venezuelans to, quote, go back to your country. Ironic, don't you think? Xavier wrote, things changed on a geopolitical level when Maduro agreed to allow Russia to establish an airbase on an island off its coast. I am sure all the undocumented immigrants that go to ULA for help, that's the group that did the protest, will appreciate this stance. Speak with Venezuelans here in the state. They are willing to trade one dictator for another, puppet or no, for a shot at some stability. Today's freedom fighter, tomorrow's dictator. And here's one, there's a guy named, or a woman named Nuance who wrote in. And later in the comments, Brian, because Nuance, put the name Nuance because this person agrees part with both sides. I want to read you what Nuance wrote, because at the end, he mentions that he's married to a woman from Venezuela who had been low income in Venezuela, because the argument is that the Venezuelans here who are protesting had money.
All
so they
people who
didn't
had
like the
something to
socialists
lose.
do it. Yeah.
Right. They didn't like their assets being nationalized, basically.
The Nuance wrote, if you spend any time with social workers, you know that it's important to be able to hold both. Meaning here that sometimes we need to acknowledge that two conflicting views may actually be simultaneously true. I'll tip my hand here. I'm with Nuance. In this case, one,
same.
The U.S. track record in Latin America and throughout the world is atrocious and usually grounded in self-interest. At the expense of the people, the intervention purportedly helps. That certainly seems to be the way U.S., quote, humanitarian aid is headed. Two, Venezuela is experiencing humanitarian crisis as a result of its own, many would say illegitimate government, stealing from the people under the guise of redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the most needy. Nearly all the Venezuelans I know, most of whom are not wealthy by any means, talk with their family and friends in Venezuela daily and have seen firsthand how bad things have gotten. They see a direct connection between socialism and this decline. And although I think it is more due to corruption than any aspect of socialism, I have to accept their perspective and know that it's rooted in their own lived experience. For those of you blaming the U.S. for the current situation in Venezuela, again, there are at least two things here that are simultaneously true. One, the U.S. has had a hand in destabilizing the region, and many U.S. interests have acted badly in Venezuela, namely Goldman Sachs, surprise, surprise, which bought Venezuelan debt and cashed in when the economy tanked. Two, the only sanctions the U.S. has levied against Venezuela in recent history has been against the ultra-rich members of the socialist government who have become multimillionaires while their people have starved. This is not news to the Venezuelans, I know, and they are advocating for U.S. intervention with full knowledge of the risk this brings. None of them want Venezuela to become a puppet state, and yet, even this possibility is far preferable to status quo. Also, it's true there are many, many people in Venezuela who support Maduro. Their reasons are many, but I believe they're primarily because, A, Maduro, like Chavez before him, represents somebody who speaks as if he actually cares about the traditionally underrepresented people of Venezuela, primarily poor people and indigenous communities, and B, there was some real redistribution of wealth in the form of housing and monthly boxes of supplies that benefited the roughly 50% of the population living in what we in the U.S. would call extreme poverty. Right now, the reason Guaido, I'm sorry to say that wrong, declared himself interim president, his first job is to call for elections, because the most recent elections were a sham. I'm not trying to be cheeky. I'm really just trying to help those who are 100% pro-Maduro to reconsider their position by questioning some of what their own confirmation biases led them to believe. namely that socialism is working just fine in Venezuela. The U.S. is at fault for the problems because people there are facing, and that only the rich are opposed to the current socialist government. And this is what he writes at the end. Let me show my cards here so that if we're going to debate this, at least we'll all be honest and debate facts rather than making assumptions about one another. One, my wife grew up very poor in Venezuela and now lives with me and our kids in New Haven. Two, we send boxes of food and medicine monthly because her family there lacks access to both. Three, here's interesting. Personally, I lean socialist. I believe in shared accountability for my neighbor's well-being and believe that capitalism is at the root of many of our issues. And here's the clinker. 4, I'm undecided about U.S. intervention. So, we could read these all day, and I encourage you to go to the New Haven Independent. If you look at today's debates, we have a list there. You'll see that's the first one. And you can read more of what people said. Harry Jones says he's laughing his ass off. Chavez is a breath of fresh air. So, Brian Slattery, we're reading some of the best comments of the week. With starting off with this wonderful debate about socialism, capitalism, Venezuela intervention, the crisis there. What do you think after hearing those comments? And you know that region a lot better than I do. You lived in Latin America, right, for a while?
I've visited, I guess visited many times. It's cool to read this in the comment section because it's one of those things where, having followed the story of Venezuela for, oh my God, like 25 years. I'm old.
It's relative.
Yeah, it's one of those things of, you realize that each of the commenters has a piece of the story as many, many people believe it. It's like nobody is speaking, just off the cuff. Everybody is speaking from a point of view that's really well represented out there. And it's super cool to see it.
Some of those questions we've wrestled with our whole lives, or
absolutely
against what the U.S. has done abroad,
right?
Like the goals of socialism, don't know how to square socialism with what communist countries have done with dictatorships. And no one's bringing up the right-wing dictatorships in Latin America that we propped up. But
but that's sort of, right now that's a bit beside the point anyway, right? Like this is it's a different scenario. And it's, I'm one of those people where if someone said, like, what do you think of capitalism? I'd say it's nice if we tried it finally. And what do you think of socialism? It'd be nice if we tried it finally. Yeah. Like, I don't think any of the, I mean, that's the place where, like, cheeky me would come in and say, like, none of these things has ever really been, quote unquote, tried.
And it's so funny when Bernie Sanders says, I'm a socialist, and then he puts his program, which might be different from what he believes in his heart, some of it. But what he ran on was FDR liberalism with an interventionist state to regulate the market.
Yeah, and to some extent, these labels are all things that you throw them around
social
to
democrats
describe,
in Europe. Really.
Yeah, like you throw them around to describe your place on a political spectrum, not as much your feelings about economic policies. If that makes sense.
So, what do you think? Would you intervene, and what does it mean to intervene in Venezuela?
I am with nuance where. It's one of those things where there's certainly the idea that there's a humanitarian crisis, absolutely. The question of how effective a military intervention is during a humanitarian crisis is, the track record of that is pretty mixed.
And sanctions in Iran strengthen the regime and hurt the average person.
Right. So you say to yourself, if you could have a crystal ball and tell me that the military intervention would go as planned, I would be for it.
Really?
Yes. I'm somebody who thinks that, I'm one of those people who thinks that Clinton did the right thing in intervening in Yugoslavia, for example. That was a good idea.
That's interesting. I did too, even though it went against everything I believe.
Right. But then
I remember Rosa DeLauro came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, right. I mean, same thing.
Because there was an ethnic genocide
going
on.
Even though that has turned out to be a mess with a lasting legacy, I still think it was like the better thing.
Well, in this case,
I don't know if that applies.
I keep thinking of Syria, because at least some of the people who are protesting in favor of Maduro and against U.S. intervention actually support Syria, where millions have been driven from their homes. Dozens, if not more, of chemical attacks have taken place by their government.
Yeah,
the government has killed probably 500,000 or more people. Is that about right?
Yes,
and
I mean it's huge.
The biggest world crisis, and I know at least one very prominent activist in New Haven went and met with Assad and did what people used to do with Stalin, and say, we've gone there and we see that everything's fine, it's all the U.S.'s fault and he's doing nothing wrong. I mean, that guy is the biggest
Yes.
villain on the stage of the world right now. So
Right.
that doesn't mean that solves the tricky question about Venezuela. I guess I would argue that how do we pick our military intervention? Why would we go into Venezuela and not Syria, where there's even more misery that's having
That's a
more
huge question.
global consequences? So I'm
Right.
wary of military interventions. I'm wary of sanctions.
Yes.
However, I do see the point in other ways, like when we do financial sanctions against the bankers who are close to Putin, or in this case, the humanitarian aid. I understand it's partly it's partly a publicity stunt trying to get this in to make it look like Maduro's against aid to his own people. And one of the things that Chavez did right, even though I'm not a supporter of Chavez, was he did feed more people for a while until he wrecked the economy.
Until he didn't.
Until he wrecked the economy, yeah. But
right.
so I guess I would argue, and maybe this is wimping out, that we should, when we take steps, help people who are trying to liberate themselves from the regime, but with too heavy a hand, given our history and giving the unintended consequences and giving the other places in the world where we don't intervene,
right?
I wouldn't want to do it.
Well, what I would like to see in the I mean, the reason
and then we own it if we break it.
Well, the other thing is that part of the reason that the military intervention in Yugoslavia was a good idea is because it was done under NATO rather than under a specific country, and
that is important.
It's super important. It is super freaking important that they're.
And then what is it? Ethnic genocide? Because we always feel like the Holocaust. That's always things like we're glad they win the Holocaust. Does that mean we should have gone in Rwanda?
Right.
Probably yes. But then which side do you pick is really tricky because there are local disputes where we really don't know. There's not like good guys, bad guys. We just know that like murdering one ethnic group is en masse wrong. And again, Yugoslavia have centuries old ethnic disputes and territorial disputes that we can't go in and try to settle on our own the way we broke Iraq. And we own that.
Yeah, the unilateral military interventions tend to not go that well. Because it ends
But even while it's better to do it
reasons,
as it's still to have the whole West intervene is still problematic with troops.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
most definitely.
So, but you know who it usually is always brings the most nuance to the conversation. Harry Jones, our station manager, is home, but he's weighing in, and he says Democrats love dictators. Thanks for weighing in, Harry Jones. You're listening to the Commentariat. New Haven Independent, Brian Slattery and I'm Paul Bass, your host. We're reading some of the comments from the week and weighing in on them, and we're weaving that into local music. Some of our favorite local musicians. I was wondering if Harry wouldn't mind queuing this up on your screen. One of my favorite local musicians, Tabisa, has a wonderful video called Vula. I play this one a lot because I really like it. And I think I'm pressing the right button to play it. And we'll see if we'll get it on your screen. I'm going to make this mouse work, which is not always my friend. And here we go.
Kawuvulela mnyango wakho, kawuvulela sango lakho, kawuvule ndingene bo. Ay, kawuvulela mnyango wakho, kawuvulela sango lakho. Ayani sugela toti bo. Yeah. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Scum diggy diggy down. Scum diggy diggy down. Scum di dabble do 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 dabble. Scum diggy down. Scum diggy down. Scum di dabble do 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 dabble. Avulelo mnyango wako, kawuvulelo sango lako, kawuvule ndingene bayandi sukela bo. Yeah. Kawuvulelo mnyango wako, kawuvulelo sango lako, kawuvule ndingene. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Ay, woo. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum. Whoa. Yeah. Kawuvulelo mnyango wa.
All right, Vule from Tabiza, one of the great New Haven musicians. Today we're doing local music and local talk here on Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass. I'm with Brian Slattery, the arts editor of New Haven Independent. He also edits a lot of the news stories, and he is here filling in as station manager today because station manager Harry Jones is at home not feeling well, but of course he's also
Get better soon.
He's also helping run the station remotely. Thank you, Harry, for helping us with getting Tabisa's face on the screen for the people watching on Facebook Live. And what we're doing is we're talking about some of the great comments. We're reading them from New Haven Independent Stories and then commenting on the commenters. We just got done solving the socialism versus communism debate. It's been pretty hot and heavy for more than a century, and now we've nuanced it.
We're inches away from fixing that problem.
And now, now we're going to veer off to a different ideological highway called the toll highway. The governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont, tomorrow in his budget address is expected to propose that we put tolls up on the highways. He originally said he would do it only for trucks, but now he had a low Iker come to Jesus moment. He said, I just took office. It's going to cost more than I thought, $1 billion to start getting our roads in shape. No other good revenue source. So let's also tax the all people who drive in cars. We'll get 40% of our revenue from people out of state, maybe even 50%, and we'll give a little discount to people who live in the state. Obviously, some people get mad anytime we talk about charging them anything for the public good. That's my bias. But let's see what some of our commenters had to say about this, Brian Slattery. Why don't you start with it? We wrote an article about the Riker comparison. Why don't you start with AMDC from February 17th on 7:03 a.m.
Will the tolls replace other taxes? No. Will our roads be in better condition? No. Do the tires of low income and other exemptees damage roads less? No. CT has to use what little brain power is left in the state to figure out how to get spending under control, rather than tax everything that casts a shadow. If this were part of a comprehensive, thought-out plan to increase mass transit, cut spending, and make this state livable for those who are not very rich or very poor, people might be more willing to consider. It is the failure to do what they were elected to do, act in the best interest of the people, of all the people, that has led to the public's opposition to any single magic bullet idea.
Also on February 17th, a commenter named Bikist weighed in. One thing I love about that, I love meta of commenting. Bikeist, I believe, is a phrase that might have been coined in the New Haven Independent section by someone who doesn't like the bike lobby, bicycle lobby, and called them bikeists. And I think other people who ride bikes claimed it, like
They're
queer.
taking it back, while their drivers get a free ride here. Shouldn't drivers pay for what they use? Seems fair to me.